So today we're going to talk about your ear, which is actually involved in two different things in terms of sensory perception. First, we're going to talk about hearing, which would be the obvious thing, but also about balance, because your ears play a really big role with that as well. So we're going to start by talking about some of the structures of your ear. Now for each of these structures, I'm going to say a little bit about what they are or what they do. Now I'm going to start on the outer part of your ear, so it's the left side of the picture. So over here where it says outer ear, we have a few structures. Now this is the part of your ear that you can actually sort of see or see into. There's one structure that didn't have a line coming out of it already, but it's the cartilaginous and skin-covered part of your ear that if I said ear is what you would think of. It's called the pinna. And like I said, this is skin and cartilage. And it helps to amplify and direct sound vibrations. So one of the things that we'll talk about quite a bit with the ear is how sound is not a substance, not like a molecule that would cause you to taste something. And it's not a wave like light is, but rather it's a vibration. So you can't see sound waves, but they cause vibrations in the air around you, and that's how you end up hearing things. Now, could you still hear without your pinna? Sure you could. It's just helping direct sound into your ear, but it's not actually the sensory receptor that's detecting the sound. It's just helping get the sound into your ear. Now, the other thing that you have is the ear canal, which could also be called the auditory canal. This is the part where you're not supposed to put Q-tips, but everybody does. Now in this canal, I'll just write it over here, it directs sound waves to the eardrum, and it has wax and hair, and it's supposed to have wax and hair. So if you imagine the inside of this ear canal, there are little tiny hairs, and on some days, lots of wax, and on other days, less wax. But that wax and hair are there to help prevent or limit debris being in your ear. So some of you might notice this. If you use a Q-tip, even though you're not supposed to stick anything in your ear, and you've been outside on a really windy day, especially here, especially in the summer when it's kind of dry and kind of windy, if you're outside somewhere where there's a lot of dirt or dust, you might notice that there's a lot of stuff in your ear at the end of that day. And that's because your ear, much like, say, your lungs, when you learned about them in Bio30E, tries to keep dust and dirt out. And so the wax in the hair is there to trap it and to stop it from moving farther into your ear. Now, sometimes you might have too much wax and it could block the passage of sound waves in your ear. Has anyone ever had that happen? I had that happen once. Man, the chunk that came out of my ear when the chunk of wax finally came out was awesome/gross. I was worried that I was going deaf. This was at a point where my dad actually did go deaf in one ear. He had a weird virus that degenerated his auditory nerve just on one side. And then like a couple weeks later, I couldn't hear out of my right ear. And you would think that I would look at what I do all day, every day and be like, oh, it's because I have this earbud in my ear all the time. But no. I was certain that I was going deaf, so I went to urgent care and she was like, you have a massive chunk of wax in your ear. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So I couldn't hear at all, and it's not because there was anything wrong with the receptors in my ear, but the wax was actually blocking sound. So it would be possible for the wax, which normally just lines it, to completely block the canal. And if it does, then sound waves can't get any further than that. Now, if we move to the middle section of your ear, so over here you'll see this is the middle ear. The first structure that you see is the eardrum. That's its more common name. The eardrum is technically called the tympanic membrane. Because it looks like a tiny little drum. And I don't know if in English there's a drum or a piece of a drum that has a name that sounds like that, but in French there is. Is there a drum? What's the a timpani, there you go, the timpani, and it looks like that. It looks like a tiny little piece of percussion there. But that's your eardrum or your tympanic membrane. It is a circular membrane that vibrates when sound waves hit it. So if there's not so much wax in your ear that the sound wave actually makes it that far, it's like a stretched membrane, and it'll start vibrating when something hits it, kind of like the way a drum makes a sound when you hit the membrane that covers the top of it. If your eardrum is perforated or punctured or damaged somehow, which can happen, then it can't help amplify and vibrate sound. You might still be able to hear things, but it's probably not as clear as good. The other thing that you have in the middle ear over here are these three little bones. Now they're named individually here, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. They're named that way because one of them looks like a little hammer, that's the malleus. One of them looks like an anvil, that's the incus, and one of them looks like a stirrup, like what you'd put your foot in to ride a horse, that's the stapes. You don't have to name them individually, but you should know that together they are called the ossicles. So these are tiny little bones that you have. You can break these bones, just like you can break other bones, like your femur, for example, but these are just way smaller bones. And these also help to amplify sound vibrations. And it's because they act like little levers. Now the last piece that's in sort of that section of your ear actually has very little to do with hearing. It's called your eustachian tube. Your eustachian tube connects your ear with your nose and your throat. So if you've ever wondered why someone is an ear, nose, and throat doctor, this is why, because they're all connected to each other. The job of your eustachian tube is to help equalize pressure. So if you've ever had the feeling where it feels like your ears have popped, I'm sure lots of you have experienced that. Maybe you were in a plane, maybe you were climbing a really tall mountain, but your ears popped. One of the best ways to get them to unpop is to plug your nose and exhale, but no air comes out of your nose. It actually goes through your eustachian tube to your ear to help equalize the pressure. So this eustachian tube, I like to put a star next to it, doesn't have anything to do with the process of detecting sound. yes, it helps your ear function, but if I were to ask, like, where do sound waves go, they're not going through your eustachian tube. Now, why don't we, so if we continue moving around that side of the picture, we move into the inner part of the ear. I'll use green here. So over here. Now the first structure, it should just be cochlea. When I was whiting things out on this picture, I just missed that little bit there. But the cochlea is one of the two main structures in your inner ear. It is the structure that is responsible for hearing. So when we look at the picture, this thing that sort of looks like the snail shell, that's the cochlea. Now we'll actually have lots to say about what's going on here, and the next couple of pictures will be us zooming in on this structure. So for now, I'm just going to say that it's responsible for hearing. The semicircular canals here are the structures that are responsible for balance and rotation. So helping your brain determine, are you standing up straight? Are you turning? What's going on? Now we'll talk more in depth about the semicircular canals as well. So if you kind of look ahead, you'll see there's more detailed pictures of both of those. There's also some nerves, and we'll focus on these two. The nerves in general are the ones that are going to your central nervous system. So just like you had an optic nerve that went from your eye to your brain so that eventually your occipital lobe could interpret the visual stimulus. You have the vestibular nerve that is the one for balance, and the auditory nerve that's the one responsible for hearing. So you have two different pieces in your inner ear, and then you have a different nerve associated with each of them so that your brain can detect those two stimuli differently. Now those are all the parts of the ear. Does anyone need to ask anything about any of the words? Maybe you need me to repeat one, or the way I've written it isn't clear and you can't see. Can I zoom in? I can't from this view here, but I can say what the words are. So up here we have inner ear, and this word is the cochlea, and these are the semicircular canals. Over here on the side, we have the vestibular nerve and the auditory nerve. Are there other specific words that people want me to write bigger so you can see them? Yeah? Yeah, so the eustachian tube is here. I wrote ossicles, I wrote tympanic membrane, I wrote auditory here. I think I've written all of the words. If there's anything that anyone else is having trouble seeing or wants me to write, please let me know. Now, just like with the eye, there are lots of parts of your ear. I don't think that on any one picture you would have to label every single structure, but you should be able to identify them on a picture, just like you should be able to identify on a picture of the eye where a structure is. Normally in a question, there would be 4 to 6 structures labeled maximum, not all of them, so that you could choose from them. But sometimes there's as few as 2, where you just have to distinguish between 2 different structures. So I won't ask you, here's a blank picture of the ear, label everything, but you will have to be able to potentially identify where each of these is. Anyone need to ask anything there? So we're going to move in and talk about the inner ear in a little bit more detail. Now the picture that's here, it's on your study guide as well, It's showing you a little bit about what's going on inside of the cochlea. Now I said it kind of looked like a snail shell, and so we're representing that here. And one of the things that you should know is that different frequencies are detected by the location in the cochlea that fluid vibrates. And that's what we're trying to show here. Some of you might recognize that Hz stands for Hertz, is a frequency. You don't have to be able to calculate frequency. But if we look at the entire length of it, notice how the number is quite large here, and the number is quite small here. Depending on where fluid vibrates in this structure, will allow your brain to determine which pitch of sound you are hearing. So is it a really high-pitched sound? Is it a really low-pitched sound? That'll be based on whether fluid vibrates at the beginning of the cochlea, that's the higher frequency sounds, or is it at the very end of the cochlea, that's the lower frequency sounds. Now we can hear a pretty large range of sound, but there are organisms who can hear a much higher range than we can. So some of you might have had or used a dog whistle where it sounds like nothing is happening when you blow the whistle, or you can maybe faintly hear some super high-pitched sound. But that's because other organisms who have potentially better hearing than we do can hear a larger range of sound. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about this idea of pitch in your ear? So we're going to continue looking inside of this structure, but now we're going to zoom in even a little more. We were just looking at what I say is the snail shell structure. If we were to take a little section of that structure, we would see what we have here. And then this piece in the middle here is what we're zoomed in on there. Now you don't have to know all of these terms, so I'm going to highlight the ones that you do need to know. You need to know this, which says tectorial membrane. Now if you look at where it's pointing to the top here, and you can see it on this zoomed in picture. So these two pictures are showing you the same thing, but we're just giving you a little bit more detail on the right. So we have that tectorial membrane, and just like it suggests, it's a membrane, and it's on the top, so T for top, tectorial on the top. You also need to know this term. You can see it's on the bottom. It says, whoops, basilar membrane. And you can see it identified right here. Basilar is on the bottom, B for bottom, T for top. So if we take the cochlea, which is this structure here, and we zoom in a bit, we'll see that there's this middle portion that has the tectorial and basilar membrane. There's also two other areas that are in the cochlea that have fluid in them, but they don't have those two membranes. This piece made up of these membranes is called the organ of Corti, and it is specifically the part of the cochlea that takes sound waves and converts them. So if we consider this organ of Corti, it's in the cochlea, This is where sound waves move fluid and are converted to nerve impulses. So most of the inside of your ear is filled with a fluid. Not exactly water, but close enough, a fluid. So once the sound hits your eardrum, the eardrum vibrates and it makes the ossicles vibrate, and then they start making the fluid that's inside of your cochlea vibrate as well. Depending on how far the vibration gets, like I showed you on the last slide, you'll hear a different sound. But wherever the vibration gets to, it's going to run in to this organ of Corti, and there are little hair cells. So how do we get from sound waves moving fluid to nerve impulses? Well, these hair cells that have cilia on them. Cilia, if you remember, are like little tiny hairs on the outside of a cell. Maybe you remember like Science 10, learning about some of those structures of a cell. If I look at these hair cells, which are right here, see there's those little lines? Those are the cilia coming off of the top of the hair cell. But these bend in response to vibration transmitted through the fluid. So as vibrations happen, it will make the fluid in your ear make the membranes shift a little bit, and it'll cause those hair cells and their cilia to bend back and forth. The bending of the cilia is what starts the nerve impulse. That's the stimulus. And then we send the impulse via the auditory nerve. So you can see over here there are some nerve fibers. In this picture, really, it's just a few axons from a few neurons, because there's not that many in the picture. But this is just one tiny section, and you have this whole entire snail shell structure that has lots and lots and lots of these hair cells. So collectively, they'll all meet up, make the one auditory nerve, and travel to your brain. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about either of these two pictures? Hair cells, the two membranes, are the pieces you need to be able to identify. So we'll do the same thing for hearing that we did for vision and just trace the pathway from the ear to the part of your brain that's responsible. So the pathway goes sensory ear neurons to the auditory nerve, passes through your brainstem and your thalamus, and then eventually the temporal lobe. You should already know from before that the temporal lobe is the one that's responsible for detecting auditory stimulus, but also for understanding language. Now, the three things that I've listed here, these are the things that you can perceive. So remember, perception is when your central nervous system interprets the information that it's getting. So the information it's getting is an impulse from your auditory nerve, but based on the frequency of the impulses, where the impulse originated in the cochlea, etc., you can determine things like the frequency, so the pitch of the sound. You can determine the amplitude, so the loudness. This is measured in decibels, and I'm only mentioning that because Sometimes questions will tell you how many decibels a sound was, and perhaps you will feel more comfortable if you say, oh yeah, that has to do with sound. You can also determine the direction of origin, kind of based on the fact that you have two ears, just like you have two eyes. Now, sometimes the direction of origin is hard to determine because the sound waves will bounce off of other structures. There's lots of good examples of this. I live in Cimarron, and I can hear comp football games when they're happening. Like I can hear the loudspeaker in the guy and the fireworks and the crowd cheering. But the way my house is positioned, it sounds to me like it's coming from the direction of Costco, which is the opposite direction of where that football field actually is. But the way my house is positioned, it makes the sound waves bounce, so it makes my ears think, even though I know that's not where it's coming from, that it's coming from the other direction. So that'll happen with sound sometimes, but if there's nothing in the way, you should be able to figure out where a sound is coming from. So if you're in an open space where there's no structure that could cause the sound wave to bounce off of it, and you hear, say, a siren, you should be able to tell which way it's coming from. You can probably even tell if it's getting closer or farther away from you based on how loud the sound is. Now, there are a few things that can go wrong with hearing. So even though there are many different disorders that could affect hearing, we could kind of divide them into two categories. One of them is sensory neural hearing loss. And if you look at the word sensory and neural, it's telling you what it is. Either the receptor or the nerve is damaged. So if we're talking about the receptor, we would be talking about the hair cells. They are actually pretty delicate. If something damages the hair cells, for example, really loud noise can damage them. Now, really loud noise once probably won't cause a lot of permanent damage, but if you're someone who, say, works in a really loud work environment and you're not protecting your ears, you might have hair cell damage that's irreversible. Some people who work near heavy machinery, you'll notice, wear ear muffs all the time, what look like giant headphones to protect their ears from this. If we're talking about the nerve, we would be talking about auditory nerve damage. So perhaps something happened and the auditory nerve was cut or severed. Perhaps in the case of my dad, you had a virus that attacked the auditory nerve on that side, and even though there was nothing wrong with your ear, you still couldn't hear. Now, what can you do to fix this? Well, a hearing aid is not going to help you. If your auditory receptors are damaged or the nerve is damaged, even if sound gets into your ear properly, there's no way for it to be transmitted. The other side of this, the conductive hearing loss, this is where hearing aids can help. Hearing aids can help if the problem is the sound isn't effectively getting to the receptor inside your ear. So this might be, if we think about your outer or middle ear, this could be something like blockage in the canal. This could be something like ossicle damage. This could be something like eardrum damage. Whoops. Sorry, guys. There we go. But those are some examples of your outer and middle ear structures that could have damage. Yep, that's what I'm doing. I'm not even touching this. Sorry, I'm going back. They can have damage that might cause conductive hearing loss. Now, sometimes the damage isn't reversible, and that's where you might need a hearing aid to help amplify the sounds. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about auditory disorders? We are on to our last little piece. So our last little piece is about balance. And there's a really similar diagram in your textbook if you want. It's not identical to this. Just move these out of the way. But there are two sort of sets of structures that are in your ear. On one side, you have the semicircular canals. So if you look at their name, semicircular, they look sort of like this. I think it looks like the top of a carrot, maybe, if you draw it. A beet, sure, a beet. Looks nice. But basically what we're looking at is three half circles, so semicircular canals. Now, if you look at the much nicer diagram that's below, you can see that they're not all in the same direction. So one of them goes kind of sideways, one of them goes up and down, and one of them goes diagonally. But the semicircular canals detect rotation. Rotation could be referred to as dynamic equilibrium. And so when we're talking about rotation, we would be talking about anything where your head is changing its position relative to your body. So you're looking to your left, you're looking to your right. Very frequently, we'll talk about semicircular canals in the context of an amusement park ride. Now today, the Physics 20 kids are all, I assume, in Edmonton, although it's snowing pretty heavily. Who knows where they've gotten to so far. But ideally, they're going to get to West Ed, ride some roller coasters and stuff, and really change what's going on in their semicircular canals. There are three canals for each direction. So like I said before, the one that goes up and down, the one that's sort of horizontal, and the one that's diagonal. At the base of each canal, there are little hair cells. So if you look at this diagram here, it shows you what the base of the canal looks like. So if I draw the base of the canal, kind of looks like this. I think it looks like a jellyfish, or maybe my grandma's old-fashioned lamp, whichever one you want. But at the base of each canal, you have hair cells. And these hair cells bend in response to rotational movement. And that's because there is fluid in the canals. So if you go like this with your head right now, you will shake around the fluid in your semicircular canals. You might stop and be like, whoa, that was a little bit too much, because you're sending so many signals to your brain about the position of your head, it gets confused. If a person feels dizzy, especially after doing something like riding a roller coaster, or the ever fun game of sit on that chair and I'll spin you around and then you stand up and walk around. I played that game a lot with my brothers. You just sent a gajillion signals to your brain about where the position of your head was, and it kept changing, and your brain is like, whoa, I can't figure out where we are, we feel dizzy. That's where the dizziness feeling comes from. Now, there are two other structures, the utricle and the saccule, that together are called the vestibule. Now the utricle and the saccule are this piece that's down here. So at the base of the semicircular canals, it looks like there's a pouch. Now it's called the vestibule, so maybe you can see where the word vestibular nerve comes from, because the vestibular nerve is the one that's attached to these parts of the ear that are helping you determine balance. The utricle and the saccule determine head tilt. So not is your head moving with reference to your body, but is your head pointing up or pointing down? This is static or sometimes gravitational equilibrium. So you don't have to be moving for this type of equilibrium to be detected. Just like the picture is suggesting down at the bottom, you can see the woman and either her head is upright or she's just tilted her head forward. Your head doesn't have to be moving. It's determining the tilt of your head. So you can tilt your head back, you can tilt your head forward. Perhaps you know someone who's suffered from vertigo, and they've suffered from vertigo because maybe they went on a walk where they were climbing up or climbing down a hill for a really long time. If you, say, have your head tilted this way for a really, really, really long time, things can get stuck. Now, the things that get stuck are these little otoliths. So these otoliths are like little rocks, basically. Tiny, tiny little rocks inside of your ear, so they're solid little structures. And if you look at the picture here, basically you have hair cells, and then you have a layer on top that has the otoliths. Now, if your head is just upright, the rocks won't shift too much. But if you tilt your head forward, now take a look at what happens. The rocks all shift, and if you can see, the hair cells sort of bend a little bit. So these otoliths or rocks move when the head tilts, and they cause hair cells to bend. So if I was at the top of a mountain and now I'm walking back down and my head is tilted down this way for the 2 hours it takes me to walk back down, some of those otoliths might get stuck so that when I bring my head back up, the otoliths don't move back to their position and my brain still thinks that my head is tilted downwards, and it gives you this weird feeling of not being able to stand upright because your brain thinks that you're tilted forward. I know someone who's, I think it was her mom that suffered from this, and the solution was honestly a really hard shake to try to get the otoliths to go back into their original position. It did.